One of the biggest stories in America today isn't about Republicans or Democrats, it isn't about tariffs, interest rates, or the latest political drama coming out of Washington. Something much more personal. Millions of Americans are asking the same simple question: where can I still afford to build a good life? If you're a young family trying to build your first home, or a retiree watching property taxes and insurance premiums climb every year, it can feel as though the American dream has become more expensive than ever. Every week there's another headline about housing affordability, shrinking inventories, families leaving expensive cities, or young people wondering whether they'll ever own a home. The news makes it sound like America has never faced a challenge like this before. History tells a different story. One thing that I've learned from spending my career studying countries around the world is that people rarely stay where opportunity disappears. They move, they adapt, they reinvent themselves, and nowhere has that been more true than in the United States, part of our core. If there's one constant in American history, it's that Americans have always packed up and headed towards the next opportunity. The first settlers pushed beyond the Appalachian Mountains into Kentucky and Tennessee. Then came the wagon trains crossing the Great Plains, the California Gold Rush, railroad towns that sprang up almost overnight, the oil boom in Texas, the automobile factories of Detroit. After the Second World War, millions of Americans traded crowded cities for brand new suburbs. Later came Silicon Valley, the Research Triangle here in Raleigh, Austin, Phoenix, and countless other boomtowns. Every generation has had its frontier. The frontier wasn't always wilderness, though. Sometimes it was a factory town, sometimes a suburb, sometimes a technology hub. Americans have never been afraid to redraw the map. But about 50 years ago, something changed. Beginning in the 1970s, America entered what I think of as the Great Concentration. Young people increasingly left small towns for the nation's biggest metropolitan cities. Shopping malls replaced courthouse squares. Interstate highways bypassed hundreds of historic downtowns that had once been thriving centers of commerce. Local department stores disappeared. Family-owned hardware stores struggled against national chains. Main streets that had survived for generations slowly grew quieter. Then came the second blow. During the 1990s and early 2000s, globalization accelerated. Many of the factories that had kept those towns alive moved overseas. Textile mills across the Carolinas closed. Furniture manufacturers throughout the Southeast and Virginia disappeared or downsized. Steel towns across the Midwest struggled to survive. Communities that had already lost many of their young people suddenly lost the largest employers as well. Many towns weren't abandoned once, they were abandoned twice. For years, we assumed that was simply America's future. If you wanted opportunity, you moved to New York, Boston, D.C., San Francisco, Seattle, or one of the booming Sunbelt cities. That's where the jobs were. That's where the investment flowed. That's where everybody wanted to be. And because everybody wanted to be there, something entirely predictable happened. Housing prices soared. Traffic became unbearable. Property taxes climbed. Insurance became more expensive. The very success of these cities eventually made them difficult for ordinary families to afford. History is a wonderful sense of irony. The places everyone wanted became too expensive. The places everyone suddenly forgot became affordable. Now, here's where the story gets interesting, is what I think. Throughout American history, transportation has always reshuffled the country's geography. First it was rivers, then canals like the Erie Canal, then railroads, the interstate highway system. Every new transportation technology created winners and losers. River towns faded when the railroads arrived. River towns declined when interstates bypassed them. America's never had a permanent map of prosperity. I think we're living through another transportation revolution, only this time, transportation isn't a railroad and not an interstate highway. It's broadband internet. For the first time in history, millions of Americans don't necessarily have to live where they work. A software engineer can write code from a restored Victorian home in a small town. Financial analyst can join meetings from rural Tennessee or North Carolina. An architect can serve clients across the country while living near the Blue Ridge Mountains. The railroad of the 21st century is a fiber optic cable, and is quietly redrawing America's map. You can see it if you know where to look. Take Bentonville, Arkansas. For most of the 20th century, it was simply known as a Walmart hometown. Today it's something much more. The city's downtown square is actually alive with restaurants, galleries, public art, and locally owned businesses. A former Kraft cheese factory has been transformed into the Momentary, one of the country's most innovative contemporary art centers. Miles of cycling trails now attract visitors from around the world. People don't move there simply because Walmart's headquartered nearby, and increasingly they move there because it's become a wonderful place to live. Or come here to North Carolina, where I'm recording this today. Drive just east of Raleigh to the town of Clayton. 20 years ago, many people would have driven straight through without giving it much thought. Today, the historic downtown is full of locally owned restaurants, breweries, coffee shops, beautiful restored buildings. Took my dog to the farmer's market in the main little square there this morning. One of my favorite examples is the old town hall built back in 1925. Instead of tearing it down, the community restored it as the station, creating a new space for restaurants, shops, offices, and gathering places. Rather than erase their history, they put it back to work. And that's the pattern I do find actually very satisfying. Neither Bentonville nor Clayton tried to become miniature versions of Manhattan. They rediscovered what had made them special in the first place: the courthouse square, the historic Main Street, the local coffee shop where people actually know your name, the brewery inside an old warehouse, and the Saturday's farmer's market, 4th of July parade, bookstores which actually still exist, old train depot often turned into fun little restaurants. For years, we thought progress meant replacing those places. Today, we're discovering that there were actually assets all along. It's funny, because just a few weeks ago on this podcast, I talked about the history of American retail. We went from general store to the Sears catalog, then to giant shopping malls, and finally to Amazon. For decades, we assumed Main Street had lost forever. Then something unexpected happened. Amazon made shopping malls less important. Remote work made downtown office towers less essential. And suddenly, people realized what they actually missed wasn't the mall. It was Main Street. When I moved from New York to North Carolina, after spending decades in one of the world's great cities, a few years in London, I expected to miss the energy of urban life. What surprised me was realizing that many of the things that I actually enjoyed weren't the skyscrapers at all that were walking to dinner. Seeing familiar faces time and again. Local festivals, independent, cute restaurants, holes in the wall we used to call them, but I think they're very expensive in New York now. Live music on our Friday evening, browsing a bookstore, having a favorite coffee shop. I have several. These things did not disappear from America. In many cases, they simply returned to the small towns where they had existed for generations. It also reminds me of something I've seen repeatedly throughout the world over the past 30 years. Countries everyone had given up on often become the most interesting opportunities a decade later. Expectations become so low that entrepreneurs begin seeing possibilities everyone else overlooks. Investors quietly return, small businesses appear. A few risk takers arrive, then more people follow. Look at El Salvador. Nobody rings a bell announcing the comeback, it simply begins. Sometimes I wonder if the same thing is happening in parts of small-town America, and I hope so. After 50 years of decline, they've become America's value investment. Now, let's be realistic. Not every former factory town is going to become the next Bentonville or Greenville or Clayton, North Carolina. Some communities will continue to struggle with healthcare, education, broadband, or attracting employers at all. History never promises that every town gets a happy ending. But history also teaches us something equally important. America has never solved its biggest challenges by standing still. We've solved them by moving, individually, by adapting, not always from the central government down, by building, by starting over ourselves. Foreign visitors often think that America's greatest monuments are skyscrapers. I don't think so. I'm not so sure. I think Asia has much better skyscrapers, frankly. I think America's greatest monument is the moving truck. Every generation loads its belongings into the back of one, says goodbye to the place they've always known or known for several years, and head towards what they hope will become a better future. Sometimes that journey led west across the prairie, sometimes to Detroit, sometimes to California, and in the past few decades, Florida, Texas, the Carolinas. Today, increasingly, it leads to the kind of small towns our grandparents quietly left behind, and I'm so happy to see that. And that can happen in Rhode Island, in the Northeast, throughout the Midwest. Historians often write about the rise and fall of civilizations, but Americans usually write about something different. The rise, the decline, and then the most important thing is the comeback. Perhaps the story of small-town America was never really one of permanent decline. Perhaps it was simply an intermission. Because history suggests America rarely abandons a place forever. It simply waits until that place becomes exactly what the next generation is looking for. And that's why, despite all the headlines about affordability, division, and decline, I'm very optimistic. Because if history teaches us anything, is that Americans have an extraordinary habit of finding opportunity in places everyone else had already given up on. We don't just reinvent products, we reinvent industries. We reinvent cities, and of course, we reinvent ourselves. Perhaps quietly, almost without noticing, we're now reinventing the very towns that once built America. I'm Roger Horn. Thanks for joining me for another episode of the Roger Retrospective.